Alrighty, I think we might kick off, actually. Thank you everyone for joining us. In the business of developing customer digital identity in a large enterprise, there is often a long and winding journey to success. So we're excited to welcome you here today to hear about our lessons learned in taking the National Australia Bank's digital identity, so via the ConnectID industry initiative, from ideation to experimentation and then through to market launch, which is planned for later this calendar year. We are all each here because we contributed to an initiative that will bring a bank ID type service to the Australian people. So passing the responsibility for product leadership along from one to the other over time, at essentially the same role at the same bank. So today we're going to each present one of three key phases with 2 critical steps per phase in that journey. So this product-led session is designed to help you navigate your own path forward with helpful tips on developing your vision, your strategy and multi-year roadmap, securing and engaging delivery teams, and then clearing the way forward with internal and external stakeholders alike. So please do come and see us, see me or Rick or Nat after the session. Well, we may have some Q&A at the end, but we will all happily talk about all things identity in more detail with all of you all day long. So whatever stage your customer digital identity program is at, from infancy to maturity, this workshop promises to inspire you to believe in the possibility of success with the right vision, strategy, team, and leadership. So, who are we? Well, apart from being part of a very rowdy Aussie crew who drove a road trip, we got here from LA and then we went on a road trip through the desert to get to Vegas. I am also an identity industry practitioner. I've got prior experience in regional customer success management roles at Ping Identity and at ForgeRock, in addition to a previous role as the head of Identity Trust and Safety at Australia Post. In my current role at the National Australia Bank, which is one of the big 4 Tier 1 banks in Australia, I am responsible for bringing our bank's participation in the ConnectID industry initiative to life. So that's me. Natalie here is an accomplished industry speaker and recognised business leader in Australia's identity industry, delivering results over several years at Tier 1 organisations, including Telstra and, of course, the National Australia Bank. She has extensive experience in change and product life cycle management, and in her current role at Deloitte, Natalie is responsible for leading teams implementing large-scale digital identity transformation programs of work. Welcome, Nat. And at the end there, we have Rick Iversen. He's head of product and scheme for ConnectID. This is the Australian-owned identity exchange network. It's being developed by Australian Payments Plus, or in Aussie language, AP Plus, because we shorten everything. Rick has been involved in identity for 4 years through the lens of both network operator and major bank. And prior to joining AP Plus, Rick was head of digital partnerships at NAB, focused on collaboration with fintechs, corporates and industry bodies. So that's us. So what is ConnectID? I hear you ask. Can hear you ask. Thank you. What is ConnectID? If you're not wearing the T-shirt, it's good to ask the question. There are some people wearing the T-shirts today. I'll hand over to Rick, actually, to explain at this point and set the scene for as he leads us through phase 1 of the journey to success. To you, Rick. There you
go. Thanks, Linden, and hi, everybody. So I'm Rick Iversen, the head of product for ConnectID, but prior to that, working at the Red Star National Australia Bank as the head of as the head of what's it called? Partnerships. And a digital identity network is inherently a partnership, and that's how we got started in this. What I'm going to do is put up this slide now. We've got a YouTube link. I'm not going to risk it in this room. Feel free to grab it from the pack in your app, or just Google ConnectID video. It's 1.5 minutes. It's pretty short. But ConnectID is it's an Australian digital identity exchange that we're establishing, more or less in the guise of a bank, the Nordic bank ID schemes, the It's Me service in Belgium, the Very Me and Yes.com services in Germany, and of course Verified Me just north of the border here. If there's anyone here from those schemes, I'd love to meet you afterwards and say hello. I really want to meet the Swedish version of me, so if you're around, please say hi. But today we are talking about the focus of how do you get NAB, or National Australia Bank, from, we will say NAB, it's just sort of natural National Australia Bank for those not familiar with it. But it is about getting the NAB from effectively zero to the point of being commercially ready to join a digital identity exchange. The ConnectID network is bank-led. We'll be starting with the major banks in Australia, but we're not going to stop there. We will have smaller banks, but also state and federal government participation in the network too, so it won't be exclusively financial services. So, quick sort of overview of how we're going to position the talk. So 3 phases. So the first, I'll talk about ideation and market positioning. So it's effectively the kind of how you get started and how do you sort of build the sort of almost the internal white paper just to get a bit of traction. Nat then will come in and talk about how you get the money and how you sort of go further into that concept design. And then Linden will talk more in the delivery phase of how do you keep your stakeholders engaged, your internal and your external stakeholders, and how do you get ready to go to market, which is the exciting phase we're up to at the moment. So phase 1, so the ideation and market positioning. So ideation, really this is just sort of a general term for just getting started. And your start point depends on wherever your organisation is on the journey. So, in Australia, this was 2018-ish. Digital identity was pretty new to Australia. There were a couple of early stage identity initiatives. There was a government initiative, a private sector initiative, and there was a sort of emerging sort of framework governance style body that was having some early stage conversations. But everyone was learning at the same time. What that then triggered was a sort of a joint investigation amongst a group of the banks saying, well, is this something that we should be pursuing? And I'll give credit to the colleagues and the colleagues from the other banks who were part of that conversation. And there's a couple in the room today who were part of that from the early days. And the strong spirit of collaboration that came with that. So really powerful when you actually get multiple organisations together working to solve one problem. Step 1 for us was identifying the opportunity for a major bank like NAB. So the objective here is sort of get enough stakeholder interest to then get the seed funding that allows you to do that next little step and the next little step and the next little step. And effectively it is the white paper, if you like, to use internally. And our framing of this was why digital ID, why banks, and why now? And so why digital identity? This is going to be pretty familiar for most people in the room, but it's about customer protection, data minimization, having a good UX around it, so you're minimizing friction for the relying party, data quality, fraud reduction. So really strong story in that respect, and essentially it boils down to it's the right thing to do. Then why banks? And so this is where a bit of research was really helpful, but banks are trusted with people's money and people's data already. They've got millions of pre-verified KYC customers. They've got relationships with the relying parties already. And essentially, when you're looking at creating a new marketplace from scratch, there's sort of no one better placed than the banks, given the sort of central role they play in the economy. And then why now? And this is a really, really important question, because you can believe in digital identity and you can believe that banks are the right people or the right organisations to take it to market. But why now is a really big question, because if you don't believe that it's going to be a sustainable model, you're not going to get the adoption, then actually there's no point doing it. So you could answer 1 and 2 positively and still have to wait 5 years for the conditions to be right for it to happen. But we actually had the perfect storm at the time where the federal government they were putting money into digital identity initiatives. There was increasing regulation and actually pressure from the central bank in Australia for banks to act on this. There were competitors coming into the market. And so what that means is, if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. And we were also at a stage where users were getting more familiar with sharing their data online. We had the open banking regime that was just starting to roll out, and people would have links they'd link their bank accounts into accounting, online accounting platforms as well. Now they were getting more comfortable with sharing data. We did some customer research to validate that, which I'll get onto. So it was a really strong story then to get the stakeholder buy-in, just to get a little bit of money to go a bit further. Some of the key learnings from that phase. So there's definitely some battle scars along the way, but some learnings to come out of that. UX is your best friend. So beg, borrow, steal a UX person early, at least just to help work your own minds through some of the concepts. Like, is this an app? Is it a website? Is it lots of apps? Is it one app? Should you have to sign up, or can you just reuse your existing banking? And so working through all of these sort of combinations helps even if you don't land on an answer, it helps you frame the problem a little bit better and sort of understand some of the options. Find your allies. So identity, as most people in this room will probably be aware, it's pretty niche. And most stakeholders that you're talking to, you're probably coming from a base of 0. But if you find some allies in the organisation who do know about identity and have the experience, they kind of just get it, and then they can kind of amplify that message around the bank. And so in the case of NAB, we had a couple of stakeholders who had worked for a couple of the Swedish banks, and so they understood the ubiquity of BankID in Sweden, and were able to sort of back up our message. When we were saying, hey, we think this is a good thing, you've got some senior people around the room saying, yeah, no, we use this all the time, it's great. And then the last part is find a home. So when you start doing the ideation, it's probably just a bit of a labour of love, and it's coming out from wherever you currently sit in the organisation. But pretty quickly, you need to figure out where this will live going forward. So if you actually get off the ground, it needs a home. And in a bank, that home could be lots of different areas or none. It's the sort of thing that it touches so many areas, but it doesn't actually have a natural home. So it could sit in the everyday banking space, it could sit in the payment space, it could sit because it's a network play, or it could sit in institutional banking because they're the ones who are going to sell to the relying parties, or it could sit in your open data teams or your open banking teams, or it could sit in your IAM teams. So there's a lot of different places where it could sit, or your innovation teams. And actually where we've landed in Australia is out of 4 banks, we're running it in 4 different teams. So there's no right answer, but the trick is get that home sorted out, get a supportive executive sponsor, and then pray for stability. And then your other point is just keep stalking your sponsor, and that's something that Linden and Nat will talk a bit more about as well. So market positioning. So this is sort of what's the research you do to figure out what the big questions are that you need to answer internally. And so the first one was, what are the global lessons we can learn? So what's worked elsewhere? What hasn't worked elsewhere? There are examples of digital identity schemes that have been perfectly well designed from a technical point of view, but just haven't got off the ground. So what's worked? What hasn't worked? The Nordics are a great example here. A great example of what could be possible, and particularly with a name like BankID. But we also recognise that they were 15 years ahead of us, and so not the sort of most relevant sort of example. Then you look at Belgium, Germany, Canada, which are a little bit more recent, a little bit more relevant, and we are thankful to the people from those teams that we've spoken to along the way. And this is an area where actually collaborating as multiple institutions was really powerful because everybody knew someone. So if you wanted to get into the Canadians, someone knew them. If you wanted to go and speak to the Germans, someone knew them. So it was really, really valuable to have that. So as part of that research, it was really important to call out the key differences in the models, the various models across the world. So what are the different types of participation? What are the different types of participants in each network? What type of ecosystem is it? Is it a sole provider? Is it a consortium? Is it a sort of little private network? Is government involved? What's their role? So sort of understanding some of the nuances there. Looking at the tech standards, how have they developed the network? And looking at the UX, do you have to sign up to a service? Is it just sort of naturally enabled through an existing provider? What channels do they offer? What are their key use cases? Things like that. And so that helped us figure out what our main choices needed to be, in terms of a really simple kind of grid. But it's amazing when you can boil down sort of some of your key decisions for this, unknown kind of digital identity network onto pretty much a single PowerPoint slide, where you can just sort of have a, left, right across a range of different factors, and sort of go, yeah, we think it should be one of those. We think the sign-up process should be low, and we think the channels should be high, and you can sort of work together to come up with at least a conceptual direction. Is it big enough? So this is a big question. At this stage for the banks, they need to understand that it's going to be big. Like, they want to know that you want to know whether is your business case positive, is your business case amazing, or actually is this going to be a cost? And so, as part of that, we needed to figure out how broad we would play. How far do we want digital identity to go? And so we used the framework sign up, sign in, sign off to help identify various use cases. And then we applied that across major verticals in the economy, and that threw up literally hundreds of use cases. What it meant is that there were some use cases that were pretty sketchy, and some of them actually got a chuckle. Had a bit of a laugh at the time. People were like, "Oh, dating apps, yeah, wouldn't that be funny?" But actually, roll forward sort of 2 or 3 years to present day, and we're seeing more and more that there's value in knowing that there's a real person on the end of a transaction, whatever that transaction is. This is also a really great time to do consumer testing if you've got a little bit of money for it. So what this did is it proved to us that consumers were ready for digital identity. We were getting feedback like, yeah, sounds great, why aren't we already doing it? So that was great. There actually wasn't a lot of resistance. We had kind of 20% in the negative camp, and that's probably about right. You're always going to get that tail end of people who are not going to support digital identity in whatever form. But we had 50% positive response, and then the 30 in the middle were neutral. So you look at that and go, okay, look, we've got potentially 80% market capture here, including the neutrals. And so that was great. And that also helped. We can then apply those numbers into the market sizing estimates as well. So the key outcomes from that were that financially we went, yep, it's big enough to be okay. Like, it'll pay for itself. It's fine. It's sustainable. And it'll support key drivers around customer engagement. So for a bank, it means that you've got more opportunity to stick a mobile app in front of someone's face, get a logo in front of them, engage with the banking app. Plus, it's the right thing to do. But it's really helpful that it's the right thing to do, and at least in a commercially sustainable way. And so by the end of the phase, we went, all right, we basically have to do this, and if it's not us, someone else is going to. The final part here is around business structure. So big questions here are, as a bank, could we do it alone? Or was it better as an industry play? Does it have to be an industry play? And how do we take it to market? And so coming back to the original point on adoption, it made much more sense to do it as an industry play. It's easier to pitch to relying parties when you can say you've got all the major banks in Australia behind it. The conversations are so much easier. People are receptive to the conversation. So it's a much more powerful message. It's easier then for customers to use it when there are more places to use it. and the trust from it having been provided by a bank. And you sort of start the kind of positive cycle of there's more places to use it, so you use it more, you recognise it in other places, more people start to use it, more relying parties use it because you've got the customer base, and so on and so forth. But it's really easy for that to go in the reverse. So really powerful having it as an industry play. And we realised that any single organisation in our group, no matter how big, has got 20-30% market coverage, which is great in a banking context, but in an identity context, that means that if you go it alone, 70% of customers for a relying party are going elsewhere, and the relying party doesn't want that. So it needed to be blanket coverage, and the way you achieve that is with the network effect. So we looked at consortium options. In our context, we had a couple of existing bodies that seemed suitable, and we leveraged the central sort of payments bodies to do that. So the BPay, FPOS group, and the new payments platform, which is now been rolled up into Australian Payments Plus. And we've seen that model work in other markets, particularly Canada with Interac. The beauty of those organisations is they're already familiar with operating networks, scheme governance, standards, compliance, things like that, participant onboarding, but also they're seen as neutral. There's sort of this level of neutrality about them, and they're trusted by key regulators already. And the central banks trust them and the government trusts them. So it's a really sort of brilliant sort of central place to be in order to sort of get this off the ground. And we've found that in conversations we've had is that no one's sort of questioning why the hell are we doing it? Like, it's just a really natural thing for us to be doing. And doing it with the banks. So on that, I'll hand over to Nat, who's going to take us through phase 2.
It's always fun getting off those stools. It is a little bit more comfortable than the last conference I was at, that's for sure. Hi everyone, I'm Natalie Reid. So I'm going to get the clicker first. Thank you. I'm going to phase 2. Thank you, Rick. That was awesome, and a lot of the concepts that Rick talked about will go into funding and concept design. I think for me, I was really lucky because I had a baton handed to me from Rick, and I was able to pick up on a lot of the work that he did. And you'll see that through the content that I'm going to run you through. So the first section, I don't want to turn the clicker off, apparently it's the right one. The first section I'm going to talk about is funding. Clearly the fun part of any project. And I can see you all laughing about that because everybody knows that's not actually true. But there's some key things within the funding bucket that you really need to think about, and that's understanding your organisation, making sure that you've got a really clear understanding of the benefits. Now, Rick talked about a lot of the kind of high-level benefits of having a national digital identity ecosystem and what that would bring to the economy, but when you then start to talk to your executives internally who are going to give you funding to build out the capability, you need to be able to clearly articulate what that means for your organisation. We did have an acronym in here, so we've kind of spelt it out. I think everyone knows WIFM, but this is really about what's in it for them. So there's no one way to talk about identity within an organisation, because I think if you ask every single person, depending on the business unit that they sit in, you will get a different answer to what identity means, what digital identity means, what a business case means, sadly. So you really need to be able to target your communication and how you then have those conversations internally to the people who are actually going to give you the money. Generally your executives. Just heads up. I flicked too far. I have flicked too far. There's a slide missing, I think. That's okay. We can run with it. It's all good. I'll go fast. Absolutely. So I'm going to just jump over here. I've actually kind of covered off that. Sorry, apologies. I am missing a slide. I'll jump to concept design, actually, because the funding element really actually Rick touched on it a lot, which is awesome, was really making sure that your business case is exceptionally clear, because that gets you to here, and that actually gets you to the true fun part, which is prototyping. And we have an awesome tech team at NAB, and the reality was, without being able to do rapid prototyping, we would not have been able to get to a clear business case. So let's be clear. Funding in an organisation like a financial services company for something that is not traditional core banking is very, very difficult to get. So being able to rapid prototype and then move into what you know for those business cases and getting the funding is absolutely the most important part of any business case. We were super lucky that we had a whole bunch of UX to reuse in that, and we also had a really, really strong tech team who were able to go into our technical proof of concepts, which we did based off an agreed model associated with what was the consortium at the time. Just going to clarify on two things. We did 2 technical proof of concepts for this internally at NAB, and I think most of the banks would have done 2 technical proof of concepts. And we did 2 technical proof of concepts because we did them. And I think the key fact was, going into the second one wasn't about the fact that we failed with the first one. It was about the fact that we listened to our team, that we looked at the tech, that we were able to go in, get under the hood and say, actually, that's not going to work for us. So we really learnt and tested and understood what we were going in to understand and what we wanted to get from those technical proof of concepts. A couple of the questions that we asked and got answered by our awesome teams at NAB was it easy to use? Was it easy to use for our customers? Would we be able to clearly articulate what that meant for them? Would we be able to get it through our ecosystem without having to completely change or fundamentally change our core banking? Was it easy to integrate for service providers? So somebody else using it, was it going to be easy for a large telco in Australia to integrate in it? And did it make sense for their user flows? Did it protect our customers? And does it protect citizens from, oversharing of data, from oversharing of data? Yep, absolutely. And does it meet regulatory requirements? The regulatory requirements in Australia are a little bit of an interesting environment, because we've sort of got some conversations starting to happen at a federal level around digital identity. Excuse me. But we don't have a full regulatory landscape, but we do have a really strong regulatory landscape in our banking environment. And making sure that we weren't going against any of that was also really critical in our technical proof of concepts. One of the other key things that we asked was, does it conform to standards? So standards globally, but also standards within our organisation. So making sure that we weren't going to put something in our organisations that would put us at risk. I'm going to hand over to Linden. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nat. Alrighty. So for this next phase, which is we're calling phase 3, we're going to explore stakeholder engagement and go-to-market planning. Now, often, at the beginning of your stakeholder engagement, it will look a little bit like this crazy group of hikers. The folks in your organisation, you might have one folk or some groups of people that are fully bought in and they're supportive and they're ready to comply with your direction, like lovely Sarah there. See Sarah in the middle there? She's ready to play. However, others in your stakeholder group will be perplexed or just not paying attention, and some stakeholders are quietly, like, see Carl down there in the green? He is laughing at your ambitions behind your back. And in fact, you may have some folks who appear actively hostile, like Brendan and Tara down here, and you don't, half the time you know they're hostile, and half the time you don't find out until halfway through the project that they've got other ideas for your project. And to be fair, there are some people who are not, some stakeholders are not even in this picture yet. You haven't even seen that they're there, and you have to figure that all out. So how do you get from this chaos here to here, where everyone you need is now in the picture, they're briefed on the objectives, and they're happy enough to participate in the event, right? It's a fair bit of effort. How do you smooth, as a product leader especially, how are you going to help smooth the path forward for your digital identity initiative? So the first thing I'd recommend is to start with segmenting your stakeholders into groups. You can segment them any way that you like. I think makes sense for today to go with internal, external, and regulatory. So when we're thinking about internal stakeholders, I've seen 5 key phases. First of all, you have to build some awareness, right? Nobody knows what on earth you're talking about. ConnectID, ID Connect, what are we talking about here? So for awareness, I would recommend activities like talking at town halls, department or domain level meetings, so any of those sort of monthly town hall things that big organisations do. Get yourself involved in one of those to build some baseline awareness. The second step really is education. So that's a next level down. Group meetings by division, and this is where, to Rick's point earlier, sometimes it helps just to have a one-pager. Don't have 48 PowerPoint slides, people will fall asleep. One page that shows potentially the solution, where the relying party might sit, where your participation is, how does that work, and have it, and then just speak to that and answer the questions. And then you need to move through to endorsement. So endorsement is a more formal review. You have to be prepared for things like privacy impact assessments. He's looking at you, Steve Wilson. You look at accessibility reviews. You need to do accessibility reviews. Sometimes UI folks make little changes because they think it looks cool, but it actually needs to still be able to be read by a screen reader or some other equivalent, and so you need to budget for that. There will be other reports and reviews that you have to prepare that no one else knows about, no one else on your team's even across, is things like delivery impact assessments and production readiness reviews, and they've all got lots of moving parts, and you need a lot of time actually to pull them together. And then the final phase is what I call sign-off or buy-in. So you may actually need a signature on a piece of paper from your Chief Risk Officer before you put this thing out to market, and others. Make sure you know who that person is. Stalk them in the kitchen if you need to. Follow them around the lifts or the cafeteria. Find out who they are. Start talking to them early, and make sure you know which document it is that they're supposed to be signing. In addition to the formal sign-off, I'm doing this because you may actually need a signature on a piece of paper. You also have executive sponsors who are not in your line management, who are sitting over there, or you haven't figured out who they are yet. You need their buy-in, because they're the people that come in the week before you go live and say, I haven't heard about this. I'm not comfortable with this. We need to delay the go live because I haven't been engaged, which is just, would be a disaster. So prepare for that. I'd also recommend leveraging working software and system demos as soon as possible to get stakeholders up to speed as quickly as possible. And that will help to avoid that time wasting due to misunderstandings. I think, these guys have been talking about how we all live and breathe identity. Not everybody else does. And so sometimes we have our own bias towards that. Remember that they don't wake up in the morning and think about identity like we do. So you need to make sure that they're not making assumptions about what this service may or may not be. In terms of external stakeholders, engage industry thought leaders. So I would do that through roundtables, attending conferences, and user forums. If you're in a market the time is right for you to launch a service or a solution, and there are no user forums that are relevant, make up your own. Invite your thought leaders to that. Have a discussion. It's really important that you tell them about your initiative as much as is appropriate. So they haven't gone live yet. But get their feedback. You know, it's unlikely that you and your organisation are the very first people, like globally, to ever face a specific SIAM problem. If you are, that's pretty unique, I would think. But as Rick alluded to, we're bringing a model to market that's not dissimilar to something that was done in the Nordics 10 years ago. So make sure that you're having those discussions and leverage and build your identity networks, you know, starting right here in this room. And finally, regulatory. I like to have a whole regulatory stakeholder plan. You have to know your regulators. You have to read the policy papers. You can't leave that to the legal and the privacy folks. Read the papers. And you have to know the people. And if that means getting on a plane and going to Canberra, which is not that exciting. But if it was, you have to go to Canberra. No, Canberra's lovely. If you have to go and hang out at the capital of the country and have coffee with the people who write the policy papers, then do it. So, for example, and Nat alluded to some of the regulatory overlay that we have. In Australia, we have the Digital Transformation Agency, and they have a trusted digital identity framework, which is adjacent to the ACCC, which is the Australian Competition, Consumer and Competition Commission, and their consumer data right. So you can see there's multiple layers and multiple policy pieces that could stop you from going live if you don't play ball in that space. So we certainly have to stay close to any changes, and that includes contributing to any calls for feedback. You know, you really have to get involved. In addition, clearly you have to engage your legal team to review any scheme rules or vendor contracts that you intend to sign or your executive sponsor will sign on your team's behalf. But I'd recommend that you also invite them in to run their eye over your UI. Certainly anywhere that your user interface refers to privacy policies or terms and conditions. Engage them early, but be clear on the ask, because I will warn you that sometimes if you're not keeping an eye on that, you can blow your budget on legal fees. Be mindful of that one. So in terms of go-to-market planning, which is certainly where it does start to get quite exciting, so we can talk a little more about that to market. The first thing I would recommend is a change manager. Get yourself the best change manager in the building and book that person right through to your launch, because there is a huge, in a customer identity and access management space, there is enormous impact and there's a huge amount of work, more than I think anyone ever thinks of, except perhaps the change manager. So what the change manager will do with you is produce business and change impact assessments. They will help you produce customer-facing collateral. So you might want a digital identity. What is digital identity page? That includes notifications, so legal copy. If you're sending a notification through an SMS and an email, you may have to get that approved by legal. You'll also need to be really clear on your dispute resolution direction for customers as well, mostly leveraging existing dispute resolution processes, but adding something to that pile tends to be unpopular, so you need to engage those stakeholders and make sure they're comfortable with you putting more stress on their team. You also need collateral for what we call banker assist or customer support teams. Chatbots, don't forget your virtual assistant. You will need frequently asked questions to feed the machine. It's one of those things that I think sometimes falls off the radar, and then at the last minute people say, oh, hang on, we've got a chatbot here, what are we going to feed that? We could just point it to ChatGPT and it'd be fine. But no, take control of that, do not do that. And then of course there's internal and external marketing, which is a whole other session. What I will advise on that is to get in early. Sometimes customer marketing or consumer marketing will have a 12-month plan, and if you miss that window, they may not be happy to support you. In terms of testing, a lot of folks in the room know a lot more about testing and the intricacies of that, and why it's really important that you keep track of what's happening with the testing. You need to test the system, you need to organise those system demos, and then you need to get buy-in. Test on a system that is as close to production as you can get it, as you can afford. But also, as a product person, be clear about your non-functional requirements. In particular, the potential for scale. Humans can be very unpredictable. If every NAB customer gets on the first day and signs up for this, awesome. We have to be prepared for that level of scale. But understand also as a product leader that you will be expected to sign off on whether a solution is done. So don't leave that to your solution managers or engineers. That's your job. So stay close to any defects raised and then how they were fixed. So in terms of launch, where possible, consider a soft launch or a pilot so that you can test and learn and so that you can phase functionality. So you need to be telling the team what is a must for now and what is a nice to have or what is a fast follow, and you need to understand why those priorities were made. In terms of the launch as well, make sure that you brief your executives on the date of the launch. I've actually seen some execs not know that something massive's happening in their organisation, not at the National Australia Bank, I will say, previously. You need to also warn your PR and your media people. They have to keep a track of your company social media in case there are complaints that come through that way. I'd also advise checking your competitors' social media as well in case other things are coming up through those circuits and those channels. You need a clear escalation path or disaster recovery pathway, whatever they're called in your organisation, and that needs to have mobile phone numbers, people, so that anything happens, whether that's a tech issue or a customer complaint, that they can reach you as soon as in real time almost. I will suggest on the first day having some Red Bull handy, because I have been through this a couple of times and it is a nail-biting experience when things sort of finally hit the market. It can be a very, very long day and you need to be available. And 1 week into hypercare, so assuming that everything's gone to plan and it's all awesome, take the time to celebrate. So these events are really important and often overlooked step in the process. Sometimes as a product leader, you become the face of the product or service, for better or for worse. And so it's critical to celebrate as it gives you all that time to reflect as a team. So it creates time and space to celebrate. And it's also a great time for your executives to recognise the broader team and the effort that got you there. So in summary, in today's session, we've taken you through 3 phases on the journey: ideation to market positioning, securing funding and concept design, through to stakeholder engagement and go-to-market planning. It's certainly, I've always felt it's true that sometimes leading customer digital identity initiatives in your organisation or as part of an industry-wide initiative, it can seem like this really long, winding, lonely path. On behalf of Rick and Nat and myself, we'd like to thank you for joining our session and would welcome any questions or comments that you might have on your own path to success in the business of identity. Thank you. Got any questions?
Yes, a question at the back. Yes.
Hi, yes, Julie Dawson from Deloitte.
Hi.
I just wondered if you could maybe give people a little bit of a view as to what it's been like since the Optus hack and how you think that's changed perceptions and maybe even the approach from regulators locally.
Yes, certainly. And feel free to jump up as well. I have sorry. Oh, yes. So the question, thank you, is what has the impact of the recent Optus breach been? I have certainly observed in the Australian people a rising tide of awareness around the value of their personally identifiable information. When I worked at Australia Post and we launched the Digital ID platform, it was pre-COVID, and it was really tough because we were sort of chipping away at the 100 points of ID scheme, which was based on a policy written last century and could not have imagined a world of digital. Now it's post-COVID, everyone's had to get smartphones for the lockdowns and, to swipe their COVID check-ins and so on. So there's been an awakening in the Australian people for sure. Long time overdue, very unfortunate that that's the cause. The other thing is we've had a regulatory change around the notifiable data breach. Is a regulatory change that got some teeth, and so organisations are now having to report these data breaches, and so I fear that perhaps there were a lot of breaches that we just actually didn't know about. Sorry, Optus is a major telco in Australia. Thank you. Great question. Yeah, add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So from a regulatory landscape point of view in Australia, we're absolutely seeing all regulators, both federal and industry regulators, changing the way that they think about data capture, talking about data minimisation. But so the Office of the Australian Privacy Commissioner has just done a complete review of the current Privacy Act in Australia, and I think there was something like 138 recommendations to changes to that, predominantly around privacy-preserving capabilities and the reportable data breach going from 30 days to 72 hours, which is, for most organisations, going to be really, really hard in Australia to do. It's similar to what's in the GDPR, but so that's the kind of privacy overlay it's not just Optus either. There was, I think we said 5. So there's been 5 major data breaches in Australia that have compromised pretty much our entire adult population. So.
Really nice to hear you talk, well done. Congratulations. Obviously, you can hear my voice, I'm Australian. But look, on the Optus data breach, Australia is probably one of the most governed, regulated industries in the world in how we operate. And I see an opportunity globally. And in relation to the Optus breach, how I see it is that what information people are processing, where they're processing information, and where they're getting that information from, and are they getting that from other providers, or where are they getting their information from, and what are they using, and what are their policies. So I don't think people are understanding where their personal information is going. And I think in the US, I think that is going to be a big change with the privacy framework here, where it's basically search on anything, store anything that you want. In Australia, I think how we've looked at what's happened in Optus, there's a healthcare, there's a number of breaches. It's not that the data that they're storing, it's the data that they're storing that they don't need to store. And that's more sensitive information that leads to identity. So I think that's the big problem that we've actually seen with the Optus breach, that we've got a card number which is now very unique, and in some cases that was stored. Why are you storing the driver's license number? You don't need that. All you need to do is verify the identity.
Yep. There'll be a lot of changes under the Privacy Act with regards to what organisations can and can't store and how they'll store them against individuals. So completely agree with your comment. And hopefully, under the new sort of laws coming out from the Privacy Commissioner, we'll get some really good benefits around privacy enhancing tech. Yeah. Thank you, though.
Yeah, I think we've been given the one up. So thank you, everybody.